Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us here in Parramatta and in Port Macquarie. Welcome to today's presentation for the Synapse Carers program on how to build resilience in families following a traumatic injury or a brain injury. Thank you very much for joining us. We're really excited about hearing from Grahame, talking about his experience in research and his experience in working with families affected by brain injury or traumatic spinal cord injury, and learning from his learnings in that field and that research on what are the strategies and what are the ways that families can increase their resilience responding to the injury in their loved one. We know that resilience is a term that's flouted a lot at the moment and put on motivational quotes and boards and how to build your resilience, and it's an area that we need to talk about a bit more, because the experience of families responding to a traumatic injury or a brain injury in a loved one is an incredibly challenging one, but there are a lot of opportunities for growth within the family, for the individual and for the carers. So we're really excited to hear from Grahame today and hear about his learnings. So I'd like to welcome Grahame Simpson to the floor. Grahame is a social worker and a researcher. He works at the Liverpool Brain Injury Unit here in Sydney and also with the Ingham Institute. So welcome, Grahame.
Thank you so much. Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Now, I might also just push that up a little bit if that's okay. So it was cutting me off at the eye level. So, she is indeed. So I've been, thank you so much for the opportunity to speak with you all today. It's very enjoyable. And to me, a very important thing as well, because a lot of my professional life has been focused on the long-term support for people with brain injuries and their families. And we know that families play a very strategic role, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. But just a little bit more background. I've been working in this area now for 32 odd years. One of the things that happens when you've been working that long is that it's a bit disconcerting, but you find some of the newer staff, in fact, weren't even born when you started working. So I don't know what that's telling me about my age or the long time. But I started working at the Liverpool Head Injury Unit as a social worker on the community rehabilitation team back in 1987. And so I worked for 13 years supporting both people with a brain injury and their families, sort of in that long-term perspective. But then in the year 2000, I was starting to get involved in research, and the unit has a research officer position, and I was doing my PhD at that time. So I moved into the research officer position, and I'm still there almost 20 years later. So but one of my particular ongoing areas of interest was when I was working as a social worker, and has continued in the context of research, has been in the area of families, the impact on families, and how we can better support families. And one of the reasons why it is very important, we know from access economics that family caregivers, the value of the support that they provide, and this is across the whole population, so all people with disabilities or chronic health issues, is estimated to be about the value of it $50 billion a year to the Australian economy, to the national economy. So it's a huge area. We also know that organisations like the NDIS already recognise that they're not going to be able to provide for all the needs of people with disabilities, and that that informal care provided by families is going to be a crucial partnership looking into the longer term. However, of course, the NDIS also provides us with some new opportunities, and I think there's going to be a lot of hard work over the next few years to try and make sure it's as responsive and as supportive and as appropriate as possible. But it may be one of the things that provides some significant new avenues of support that haven't been available historically. So I'm going to, so people are very welcome to make comments as they go along. If you've got the handouts, I'm sorry, I've changed them slightly, just to keep you all on your toes. There was a famous French post-impressionist artist called Pierre Bonnard, and he was fortunate enough to have paintings hung in galleries during his lifetime. You know, some artists have to die before their paintings are hung in art galleries. But he used to get his friends, he would go into the gallery where his paintings were hanging and get his friends to distract the guards, and he'd continue to touch up his paintings even after they were hung. So to his mind, they were never really finished. And it's the same with me with my presentations. I continue to fiddle with them right up to the very end, but it's largely as the handouts that were circulated. So let me now. So I'm just going to start with a couple of slides that will provide information that people already know, but it just helps to kind of set the scene for the presentation. So the head injury unit at Lidcombe Hospital was the first specialist unit that was established in Australia. It started in 1976 and internationally, the 5 years from 75 to 79 were really seen as the starting years for specialised rehabilitation around the world. So it meant that Australia was kind of sort of really at the cutting edge of developments in terms of specialised rehabilitation. Before then, people with brain injury had generally been treated in general rehabilitation services, and there were a lot of challenges and problems arising from that. And so what the service did was that Robin Tate looked at the first 100 people that were admitted to the head injury unit at Lidcombe Hospital and did a 6-year follow-up. And then she followed up that same group of people 20 to 25 years post-injury. And so we can just see here some of the results in terms of the people that were part of that study. And so at 6 years post-injury, about 15% of the people had mobility impairments, and at 23 years that had increased to 25%. So one of the things that we know about brain injury is that generally it doesn't have a big impact upon mobility. That's sort of one area where things generally people have preserved ability or capacity, although there are a small proportion of people who do face ongoing mobility challenges. In terms of self-care, as you can see, that the number of people that were facing challenges in self-care also wasn't large. But then when we move into the area of employment, there was almost half of the people had challenges with employment at 6 years, and that increased to 2/3 at 23 years. Now, maybe part of the issue there is also that people were starting to retire, but also we think there may be just that cumulative effect of the impact of employment. In terms of relationships, once again, high levels of challenges in terms of people in relationships, and also then in people's independent living skills. Though some slight improvements there over the two decades. However, plenty of areas where people are needing support. Now, sorry, let me just get this. There we go. With the then I guess the fact that at even 2 to 3 decades face challenges has an inevitable impact on the family. And so we have now almost 30 years of research that reinforce the fact that there are high levels of depression and anxiety that are reported by family members, that subjective burden and increased help-seeking behaviours are common, that family members report at times feeling overwhelmed, that there are challenges in terms of financial disadvantage. Often some caregivers are having to reduce their hours of employment, or they give up employment completely and become more socially isolated. And also that there can be changes in family functioning, including reduced levels of communication, effective involvement, and general functioning. I can move that there. All right, that's okay. You are cutting off my head. Now, I can sit down. Would that be easier? If, I'll take that. Okay. So, and I guess the issue is that this really is the picture that's been painted about the caregiver experience for the past 30 years. And so there's been very little focus on wellness or well-being, the presence of positive emotions and new learnings, and how these might be part of the caregiver experience. And so that becomes the kind of the launching pad, in a sense, for the work that we've been doing. So David Saleeby and others started to observe, and this is back in the 90s, that demanding and stressful experiences do not inevitably lead to vulnerability or a failure to adapt in psychopathology. And so what researchers were beginning to notice was that a significant proportion of people were actually thriving in the midst of adversity. And in the early days of resilience research, this was particularly noticeable in a few longitudinal studies of children. So Wallen and Wallen observed that only a third of children that were raised in challenging family circumstances actually ended up succumbing to their situation. Many did not, and went on to lead fulfilling and successful lives. And so I guess part of the question is, what might this be the case? And one possible reason for this may be the presence of resilience among caregivers. And so what we're going to do in the next few minutes is just to look at various approaches to defining resilience, as presented both in popular culture, programs in the education system, dictionaries, and in the research literature. So if we start with Tigger, Tigger is very, very bouncy. The idea of bounce, or more specifically bouncing back, is often cited as being key to resilience. And so many people agree, or may agree with this sentence here, that life is not about how fast you run or how high you climb, but how well you bounce. And the concept of an individual bouncing back can also be seen in the New South Wales education system. So the program Bounce Back, found in some schools, is being used to teach resilience among school children. And using the acronym BOUNCE, children are taught that bad feelings go away again, that other people can make you feel better if you talk to them. Unhelpful thinking makes you feel more upset, that nobody is perfect, mistakes help you to learn, that concentrate on the good things and have a laugh, and that everybody feels sad or worried sometimes, not just you. If we turn to dictionary definitions, the Merriam-Webster dictionary defines resilience as the ability to become strong, healthy, or successful again after something bad happens, or the ability of something to return to its original shape after it's been pulled, stretched, pressed, bent, and so on. And if we turn to the research literature, Gail Windle and her colleagues came up with the following definition based on a review of over 200 published research studies that addressed resilience. These studies were in the aged sector, not in the brain injury or disability field, but it's probably the most exhaustive attempt to define resilience that's taken place to date. And they came up with the following definition that you can see on the slide there, that resilience is the process of effectively negotiating, adapting to or managing significant sources of stress or trauma. Assets and resources within the individual, their life and the environment facilitate this capacity for adaptation and bouncing back in the face of adversity. And across the life course, the experience of resilience will vary. So one can note some important elements in this definition, such as the key role of assets and resources, but that these are located in the individual, but also in their life. And by their life, I think they're meaning people's life experiences. So people draw upon previous life experiences in facing current and future challenges, but also importantly within the environment. And by the environment, we think that means the social and economic resources that can help people face the challenges in the caregiving experience. And we'll talk a bit more about this as we go along. The other thing is that this concept of bouncing back is a core element of this synthesis. And I don't know if many of you have seen the movie The Kung Fu Panda. It's a very famous movie, and the fat panda was nominated as the Dragon Warrior. And when they were testing him out for his martial arts skills, they had to keep lowering the bar further and further and further because he basically had no skills. But in the end, they got him to punch this plastic kind of dummy that had a rounded bottom. And so sort of when he was able to punch it, it would fall over, but then it would right itself back up to the same position. And so that's often seen as the idea of bouncing back. People get knocked over, but they come back up to the same position. However, I guess one of the questions that we would have is resilience just about bouncing back, as suggested by these cultural and school-based and dictionary and research definitions. The definition that we've been using in the work that we've been doing with families at the unit at Liverpool is that resilience is seen as a dynamic process encompassing positive adaptation within the context of significant adversity. And what this definition encapsulates is the dynamic nature of resilience. So it's a process and that it's a set of skills that people can actually learn. So the traditional understanding of resilience was that it was more of a personality trait, so that you were kind of either born with it or you either had it or you didn't. But what I think the current understanding, as we've looked into this area more and more, is that it's a set of skills and qualities that people can acquire. And what that then means is that together we can actually learn and work out how we might be able to build a resilience amongst the families that are supporting people with a brain injury. And Froma Walsh, and I'm going to talk a bit more about her in the next few slides. In her framework, she talks about bouncing forward rather than bouncing back. So there is a process of growth in the adversity, facing the adversity and challenges. And we think that that's a very important starting point in our understanding of resilience. So traditionally, the image of resilience is reflected in this image of the climber, someone who's tough, hardy, hanging on against the odds because of one's personal attributes. And this idea, of course, has been around for a very long time. However, we don't think this is the whole story. So we don't think this sort of image actually encapsulates all of what resilience is about. Awareness that resilience is also about the social context. So terms such as family resilience and community resilience have been used more and more frequently. And many have realised that not only can significant relationships with family, partners or mentors, such as coaches or teachers, play a crucial role, but there's something to be said about the resilience of a whole family or a whole community. And so if we start to think a bit more about family resilience, it's not just the sum of the individual members So Froma Walsh has said the concept of family resilience extends beyond seeing individual family members as potential resources to focusing on risk and resilience in the family as a complete unit or as a whole. And in her work, Froma Walsh suggests that resilience involves key processes over time that foster a family's ability to struggle well, surmount obstacles, and go on to live and love fully. So what might family resilience look like? Within Froma Walsh's framework, there are three principal domains of interest. First, a family's belief systems. Second, their organisational patterns. And then thirdly, their skills in managing the challenges, drawing upon both communication and problem solving. So if we kind of unpack this a little bit more, just going through each of these three areas, the three areas that Froma Walsh identified within family belief systems included making meaning of adversity. And so this is the ability to recast a crisis as a challenge that is comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful to tackle. And such a process can be very empowering when people are able to do that. Secondly, holding a positive outlook. So this is a family's hope, optimism, and focus on potential. And then thirdly, in terms of transcendence or spirituality. So the larger values, faith, congregational support, transformation and inspiration evident within the family. Transcendence or spirituality may encompass religion, but it may be a deep personal connection with nature, music, the arts, or a higher power. The second of Walsh's domains of family resilience are organisational patterns. And so key processes within this domain are flexibility, so the ability to be open to change, stability, good leadership, connectedness, and then social and economic resources. And so one of the critical things that we really think is that resilience isn't about families just struggling on by themselves, like that sole mountaineer trying to climb up the mountain. But one of the core aspects of resilience is the being able to mobilise the social and economic resources that people need to make the challenge of providing care a manageable task. And so it's not about an individual, but it's about an individual being properly resourced to undertake the roles that they're wanting to undertake. And then last of all, Walsh identifies the domain of family communication and problem solving. And within this domain, she perceives key family processes, which include open emotional expression, sharing feelings, so just not holding things in, the use of humour, collaborative problem solving, which can involve brainstorming, learning from failure, and a proactive stance to prevent problems. So not just waiting for something to occur and then responding, but actually troubleshooting and looking ahead and seeing where potential issues or challenges might come up and try to respond to them before things actually happen. So Froma Walsh, however, is not the only person who has suggested that resilience might be about a whole family rather than just an individual. And in her review of the literature on families who are caring for a child with disability, Joan Patterson identified 9 aspects of family resilience. And once again, these aspects applied to the whole of the family rather than just individuals within the family. And so these included balancing the illness with other family needs, maintaining clear boundaries, developing communication competence, attributing positive meaning to the situation, maintaining family flexibility, maintaining a commitment to the family as a unit, engaging in active coping efforts, maintaining social integration, and developing collaborative relationships rather than sometimes combative relationships with professionals. So this is kind of what's been, the ideas I've been introducing you to are things that are located in the published literature. And the work was talking about, I guess, resilience and family resilience in the context of a broader range of issues. These weren't works that were specific to families dealing with someone who had an acquired brain injury. So we've then done some research to look at how well some of these ideas apply to the context of actually families supporting relatives with a brain injury. So one of the things that we did was that we've looked at the lived experience. And so we ran a number of focus groups where both with family members supporting relatives with acquired brain injury or a spinal cord injury, and also health professionals as well, to kind of get their ideas or thoughts and experiences. And what we found was that when we looked at the results from all the things that the families had been telling us, that we could kind of group it into four kind of categories. And so the first of those four categories was the qualities and strengths associated with resilience. And so family members and health professionals identified a number of similar qualities and strengths that were associated with resilience. So both talked about the importance of previous experience. However, the health professionals exclusively nominated previous traumatic experiences, so that people had survived or got through a traumatic experience, whereas family members identified a broader range of life events that in fact helped them in a path of growth to resilience. So these included things like parenthood or a rural upbringing. So it wasn't just purely traumatic issues, traumatic experiences that helped to build their resilience. Health professionals referred to family members who had a clear sense of self, and this kind of was reflected in the response of some of the family members in the focus group who talked about the importance of being independent and recognising one's own internal strengths. Family members provided examples of attitudinal mindsets that they associated with a resilient outlook, such as taking a positive outlook and looking ahead, which once again is that kind of idea of being proactive. Family members frequently talked about their faith in God and also about closer bonds or a deeper appreciation of their relative with a brain injury as well. Finally, health professionals highlighted a number of cognitive, personality and behavioural attributes that they associated with resilience, once again around being proactive and realistic. And two of and I think then the second theme, I was saying there were four themes. So the second theme was this one around whether or not resilience is innate, so something that we're born with or something that people can acquire. And overall, family members who were in the focus group tended to believe that resilience is a quality that people can acquire. They spoke of being driven by necessity or not having a choice. They had no choice to look after myself. Some of them actually, for the first time in their lives, they discovered that they had an innate resilience that they didn't know was there because they'd never previously been in a situation that was so challenging that meant they had to. So it was kind of like a sleeping part of their personality or who they were. And so it was then a process of learning that, in fact, wow, I actually am resilient. I am managing this issue. So it was kind of like a hidden aspect of the attributes that people have. So the third theme then was around resources that people with resilience drew upon. So the health professionals referred to the importance of the social and environmental supports in building resilience. So once again, this is this idea that it's not a sole person, but resilience is about sort of a whole range of different resources and supports. So the health professionals referred to four types: social supports, health services, alternative therapies, and instrumental support, which included things like financial assistance and attendant carers, being able to draw upon attendant carers. The family members broadly interpreted resources as an internal characteristic. So they talked about the importance of a positive attitude, being aware of one's own needs, doing something for oneself, that this was important, the option of returning to work where that was possible, and maintaining personal and physical health through being active. Um, Agreeing with the health professionals, they also highlighted the importance of financial support. Interestingly, the families referred far more frequently to the supports they got from friends and other family members, with less mention of formal peer support groups, services, or networks, although clearly they were also playing a role. And in terms of then how might resilience be fostered or developed, I think one of the key things that families highlighted was the importance of learning from other families that were working, that were also providing support. The families that we were interviewing were generally slightly earlier post-injury, and so they were very interested to be able to speak to families who were further down the track, to find out about, sort of how they were facing the challenges and the journey. And then finally, the health professionals highlighted that there are personal skills development, formal social supports, and access to services. So if we start to think about resilience, what we're trying to do is flesh out this understanding of resilience. And so we really think that resilience is a multi-dimensional attribute, I guess, or construct. So it comprises a mix of some personal skills, social competence, and spirituality. And as we've been saying, it's not just a personality type, but a skill that can be acquired. So in the research that we've been doing, we're starting to find evidence for these kind of 5 different components of resilience, namely hardiness, the mobilising social and economic resources, the spirituality, the problem solving, self-efficacy, and the positive mindset or hope. So in terms of hardiness, as we were saying from the focus groups, family members talked about this being driven by necessity, not having a choice, about it being an undiscovered personal quality. However, in the popular kind of media and understanding of resilience, the kind of it stops here. This is kind of the extent or what people think of. But as we are saying, this is only, from our understanding, that this is only one of the multiple possible components that contribute to resilience. So as we said, the second one then is mobilising the social and economic supports. In the focus groups, family members talked about accept help when it's offered, be specific about what will be of most help if people are offering help. And I think also then it's about finding resources. And when we run some of our family groups, the family members will often exchange information about local services or resources that they've found that they've been able to take advantage of. And certainly, if anything is a core message from this presentation, is that resilience is not a solo effort. So I think that's really critical. And why the Synapse program is so important. Just put in a plug there for the program. So then in terms of spirituality, spirituality is a concept that's considered to be overlapping yet distinct from religion, and sometimes separate from the physical, social or psychological. So it can encompass a realisation of the ultimate purpose and meaning in life. In contrast, religion is generally considered to refer to a formal system of beliefs held by groups of people who share certain perspectives on the nature of the world. So meaning and purpose may be derived from such beliefs, but also from other sources of spirituality, such as the natural world, connectedness with others, and within oneself. And we find very strong links between spirituality and resilience. Now, this may seem kind of quite a complicated sort of figure, but this was one of my colleagues, Dr. Kate Jones, who is based at Royal Rehab, and she developed this model out of doing a series of interviews with 10 people with a spinal cord injury and a significant other, and she interviewed them first when they were an inpatient and then did a second interview with them 6 months later. And so what she found was that there was this overall theme that what the family members and were talking about was the journey. And and in terms of that journey, there were existing sources of spirituality, which might have been religious faith, the natural world, an inner strength, or the relationships with other people. And then in the context of the injury having taken place, these sources of spirituality were tested. And so there were a number of questions that then came up, sort of, why has this happened? Why has this happened to me? Were we doing something wrong? Why is my partner or my family relative being injured? Also then testing in terms of people's inner strength. Will I be able to go on? Will I be able to continue to cope? And then testing in terms of relationships, who will be here for me? And certainly one of the things that both people with a brain injury themselves talk about, and family members, is that you really find out who your friends are in these situations. And so there are some people who provide a wonderful level of support, but there are other people who really fade out of the picture, or who don't rally around at all. So it's a really testing period in finding who one's true friends are. And that's not to be judgmental about people. Sometimes for some people it's such a confronting or overwhelming issue, they really find it hard to respond to it, or to know how to provide help. So one doesn't necessarily judge those people who may sort of move away or absent themselves. But no, the other side of that are the many wonderful stories of the support that both family members provide, as well as friends. You can then see that the next part of it then is the meaning-making responses, and that they then lead into some of the sort of the outcomes, which includes gratitude. So that and people might be a bit surprised by that, but there's often a gratefulness that I'm still alive, or my relative is still alive, or that that the person wasn't injured as severely as that might have happened, or this has brought our family closer together. So there's a number of different ways that people, the people that Kate was interviewing, were grateful. There was hope, just in terms of recovery, but also in terms of relationships, and in terms of a future life, and then also in terms of relationships as well. And so all of these different dimensions kind of were part of this journey that people went through on their road after a spinal cord injury. But I think many of the experiences and observations that people made there are also applicable to acquired brain injury as well. So then in terms of we've talked about hardiness, we've talked about mobilising social and economic resources as components of resilience, and we've talked about spirituality. So then the next one is a positive mindset and hope. And in this, we're trying to broaden the definition of hope, and particularly because this is from the perspective of the family members. So it's not just hope narrowly focused on the recovery of the person with a brain injury, because we know, as my original slide showed, that for many people, certainly not all people with brain injury, but for many people over the long term, they will still face challenges. They'll have disabilities. They'll need support and care. So it's not just purely hope in terms of the recovery of the person with a brain injury, but in broader terms, particularly from the context of from the perspective of the family member, as a future-oriented and task-related psychological resource. One of the things that really surprised me when we started to look at the last 30 years of research studies, that in fact there were no studies that had actually administered a questionnaire about hope to family members, and either after brain injury or spinal cord injury. And so as part of some of the resilience research that we're doing, as far as we can tell, we're the first group to actually have started to explore the role of hope. And once again, as I was talking about right at the beginning, we're kind of interested in looking at dimensions of well-being and wellness amongst as part of the caregiving experience, not just the downsides and the negative sides. The final component that we've identified is problem solving and self-efficacy. And so problem solving can be defined as the process of finding solutions to difficult or complex issues. And there are many well-known models for learning problem solving, and many family members kind of know these things intuitively, just out of their own sort of life experience. So if we then come back and think then about resilience, we have this idea that resilience is really around a number of different components in people's lives. But the really good thing is that you don't need all of these components to be resilient. And so, for example, for some people, they might say, oh, well, you know, I have a very, I do feel that I rate very highly in the area of hardiness, but I'm not really a spiritual sort of person. Or somebody else might say, well, yes, you know, I have a very strong positive sort of mindset, but I'm a bit socially isolated, so I haven't been able to mobilise a lot of social and economic support. So you don't need all of these components to be resilient. But one of the things that would be, but you know, sort of our kind of feeling would be that people would sort of need some of them. And based on my 30 years of experience with families, I know that families have sort of, I guess, attributes in some of these areas, or many of these areas. You know, sort of, because I was working on the community rehab team, I worked with people with brain injury and families over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, and we still have clients who get back in contact with us. In fact, last year I had two of the first families that I saw back in 1987 get back in touch with me about a month of each other, which was quite sort of weird. But yeah, so you know, we sort of just over that long term, we and working with families and supporting families and seeing what families do, we know that all family members have some dimensions of resilience in their lives. And so what we're then wanting to do is we're wanting to look at how might we be able to build that and encourage that even further. And we think that that can be done both through, I think there are programs that brain injury services and support services can be providing, but also it's in the context of families learning from each other as well about what works and what doesn't. So one of the things, just in finishing off this presentation, it would be good just as a personal reflection if you were able to put aside 5 or 10 minutes and think about each of these areas, and you can go back and look in your presentation at the way that we've been defining them, and then give yourself a rating on from 1 to 10 on how much of the each of these components is something that you draw upon in undertaking your caregiving role. You know, it may be if you feel you have a high level, you'd be scoring yourself at an 8 or a 9 or a 10, or if it's an area where you don't rate yourself very highly, then you might be scoring a 1 or a 2 or something like that. The second question then is that, are there any of these components then that you would like to have more of in your life? And so that then becomes the next challenge. And certainly I think if there were areas that that you're interested in, that would be something you could talk to Laura and Sonia about, Lauren, sorry, or it may be something that you can talk about with your local service providers. And there may be ways that you can also identify to build up some of those areas. And then finally, are there any that we should add? So are there areas that we're kind of missing in terms of understanding or thinking about resilience? We're kind of just building this picture up. These are the areas that to date, the research that we've been doing tells us that these domains or components do play a role, but we don't think this is necessarily comprehensive or the end of the story. So, so we would be interested in any feedback from people about other areas that they think we should be considering. And what you can just see there on the final slide is a picture of the Strength to Strength program, which is the program that we've developed, which aims to build resilience amongst families supporting relatives either with a brain or cord injury. So this is one of the, I think, of what we'll see over the next 10 years or so will be a new range of programs that start to focus on how can we promote family wellbeing in the context of the caregiving experience. So thank you very much. That's it.
Thank you very much, Grahame. That's been a really, really wonderful presentation explaining, I think, resilience in a much more meaningful way for families beyond just a catchphrase of building resilience. It's been much more an exploration of what it actually means in the context of a family who are supporting an individual with a brain injury. And I think taking stock from that presentation and thinking about the five areas, one of the things that came up in our presentation last month by a lady named Arabella, she was talking about ways to improve skills in looking after a person with brain injury. And something that she said that really struck a chord for the people in the room and for myself was that sometimes it can feel like you're a one-person cheer squad for the person that you're looking after. And that really hit home with me and for the people, thinking that they might have been doing it alone. And so I think one of the things that you spoke about was about mobilising the social and economic resources that are available. Was there, for some of those people who may be feeling like they're a one-person cheer squad, were there any tips that came out of your focus group research with families who demonstrated resilience about ways of mobilising social resources?
I think there's both informal supports and formal services. So there's kind of two different avenues. And so what some of the families were talking about was the fact that there were members of the family that were willing to play a role. And that could be a wide range of different roles. So it may be something like doing the shopping. It may be, if there are other children, taking the children for a weekend so that, so that the person that's providing the primary support isn't having to juggle both the children as well as the person with a brain injury. It may be that there are legal issues or things like that, and so family members were attending to those things. So it was really drawing upon the broader resources within the family and the extended family. However, not everyone has family or a lot of friendship networks that they can draw upon. And so in those contexts, then it's really looking around what type of community support. So some families we know were involved in churches, or there were sporting clubs that did fundraising. So there were other community organisations that played a role. But then there's also the service systems, and once again, in the importance of families being aware of the types of entitlements or service supports. And it's not always easy to know. because the kind of services, often ways of accessing services are very complicated, and there's not always a lot of information. So being able to touch base with other caregivers or with organisations like Synapse or local care coordination services, I think brain injury services is an important sort of way to go. I think it's important not to wait for the world to come to you. I think people do have to go out and search. One of the things that we certainly know, though, is that people often, when they've been providing support over a long term, they may sort of be in a situation where they've exhausted a lot of the avenues that may be there. However, things don't stay the same, and once again, government programs don't stay the same. And so if there weren't services available 5 years ago or 10 years ago, that doesn't mean that there may not be new services or resources that are available now. So that's important to kind of keep checking, or to find a way to just keep on top of what might be evolving.
That's really, sorry, we're just going to keep sharing the mic. I think that's a really good point around services change. I mean, a lot of carers will be now experiencing the massive change that is the NDIS. If the person that they're supporting is able to access that support. And so that shift in government support has certainly meant that things have changed, and maybe the family or the individual or the carer is now eligible for services and supports that they weren't eligible for 5-10 years ago. It's always tricky when you don't know what you don't know. So reaching out to services, reaching out to friends, hopping on forums and things like that, trying to say, this is where I'm at. Does anyone have any suggestions for me? And by doing that, by reaching out not only to the formal supports, but those informal networks, you're building up your own friendship and social resources by doing that. One of the other things that was really interesting in the discussion around spirituality, and I have heard Kate Jones speak about her research, and have listened to a few different talks on spirituality and the benefit of spirituality in continuing in a caregiver role. One of the important things is that and I know you did say it, was that when we talk about spirituality, we're not talking about a formal religion necessarily. We're talking about the individual, the personal belief system, and how that can be beneficial to an individual in continuing their caregiving role. Was there anything else you wanted to add on that, Grahame?
So if we look at the Australian census about religion and spirituality, what that tells us is that there's been a declining proportion of the population that are involved in sort of organised religion. It's still about 44-46% of the population as a whole. So now that means that people identify themselves with a particular religion. That doesn't mean they're actively involved in that. But at the same time, the census also says that probably up to about 60% of Australians kind of accept, or that there's some spiritual dimension to life. So, there are certainly many people that kind of seek that that connection, that sense of transcendence, or being part of a larger whole in a number of different ways outside the organised religion. One of the things when people are involved in sort of religious organisations, though, is that what we also know from the research is that they're often avenues that people receive social support from. So it's not just purely the spiritual dimension, but religious organisations often have a dual role. So there's both a social dimension of coming together with a group of people, as well as that kind of religious or sort of upward dimension towards the higher power. So, and certainly within that context, that's where we've found that for some of the people that we've worked with, that they've received support, sort of from other people, sort of who are part of that faith group or religious group that they might be part of.
Were there any other questions? That's wonderful. We've just found that someone on the YouTube chat has said it's a very interesting, informative presentation. So thank you very much for that, Grahame. It's and if anyone has any more questions, feel free to get in touch with myself. If there are questions that I can't answer and we don't have access to, I can always reach out to Grahame. But please feel free to get in touch with us. We're happy to talk to anyone at any time. Sorry about that. So once again, thank you very much, Grahame, for volunteering your time and your wisdom to talk to us today. Thank you very much to people who've come to the groups. We hope that you've learned a lot from it. Next month, our presentation will be on accommodation and housing and thinking outside the box as to how that part of a person's care, which may be needed for some people, how that can be thought of in a different way now that we've got the NDIS and we have different ways of providing accommodation for loved ones with disability, and considering whether that's a requirement for you and your family, and how supported independent living can actually support and increase the independence of the person that you are caring for rather than reducing independence. So thank you very much. We look forward to hearing from you during the month, and look forward to hearing from you and seeing you next time. Thank you very much.